Welcome to Buddha at the Gas Pump. My name is Rick Archer, and my guest this week is Neelam. Welcome, Neelam.
Welcome.
I'm
here.
I am too. I've been looking forward to this for a long time, and I have some very dear old friends who have been students of yours for many years, and who I think have been encouraging both of us to do this. So I'm glad that we finally got around to doing it.
Yeah, I'm happy. I'm happy about it too.
So I don't always start interviews this way, but in your case, for some reason, I have the feeling to just ask you to summarize for us what you would say your basic teaching is. Would that be okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so, I would say that's, let's just be quiet for a moment, Mm-hmm. Let's just sit quietly for a moment here. So, because maybe the most important thing to say and the most important thing to remember is that presence or our nature or who we really are, that is already here. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that no matter where we are, no matter what's going on, no matter what we are doing, no matter what's happening, that we can notice our nature. And the reason I always say that in the beginning, and the reason I always remind everybody on it, is that so often, even when we are on a spiritual path, even when we actually already are knowing that what is it that we are looking for, right, we still possibly live in this either big or small level of postponement, right? Like there's some time that I'm going to get there, there's some thing that I'm going to, there's some moment that things are going to change, there's some place that I'm going to arrive, and by doing that we miss what is already present, right? So I really, always, myself, you, and everybody, I invite, first of all, to just check, in this moment, right, and see, and make sure that, what we are looking for, what we want,
Mm-hmm.
that it's already here, right?
Would it be true to say, would you agree, that even though it's already here, it can be even more profoundly here? In other words, or one's appreciation of it can become more profound or enriched or deepen or clear or whatever. Sort of like, what's an example? I don't know. Like maybe music is already here on some scratchy little radio and you're hearing Beethoven, but if it's a beautiful stereo system, you could hear the very same symphony but much more clearly than with the little scratchy radio. So there could be some enhancement or deepening or clarification of one's experience of presence over time.
Well, it's really the reason I start with this, basic, and there's more to what my basic teaching is.
Mm-hmm.
This is just the very beginning of it, but the reason I start with it is because that's really the foundation, right?
Yes.
And we need to remember that, because otherwise we can imagine, see, this is all imagination, that we are going somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And by doing that, we really are not going anywhere. We just really postponing what is already here, right?
Yes.
But a big part, of our ability to be here is that our attention is not really trained to be here, right? That our attention is not used to just really recognizing or resting in our true nature, right? And maybe even more so, I would say, habitually, and that's the past, That's, you know, what we are used to. That's what really brings us into this life. That's what really, if not recognized, causes and perpetuates suffering. That our past is what takes our attention, right? Or the past is what takes our attention, right? So first we need to recognize presence is already here. Then we need to recognize that in these moments of resting here, that everything is okay the way it is, right? That nothing has to change, that nothing has to be different. This is all our imagination again, you know, the imagination of the body mind of how things are supposed to be and how they are, where they are going and what's going to happen and all that, right? And then we also have to, you know, so we have to recognize that presence already here, okayness already here, right? That suffering is really caused by our movement away from that, right? That every time we believe something different than what our nature really is, what the truth of our nature is, then we experience suffering, right? And then that we can do something about coming back and facing that in a very direct way, which is inquiry, which is really an inquiry process, right? And that eventually we really find freedom, and that's what you're speaking about, which is abidance here no matter what, right?
Right.
Abidance here no matter what arises, but initially, you know, our attention is just all over the place. It's just, you know, trained to go with whatever arises here, right? It doesn't really stay here. It doesn't really rest. So maybe, so we can't recognize the fullness. We can't recognize the you know, absolute fullness of who we are, right?
Yeah, because I mean, life is very intense for many people. Most people, I would say. I mean, we're very privileged in a sense among all of humanity in terms of how easy our lives are, and even we must have our difficulties. But you know, the average person is just tends to be overwhelmed by distractions and pressures and problems and so on. And now people on a spiritual path, you know, they're kind of looking for a way out of that. And as you say, perhaps the first thing to recognize is that, you know, what you're looking for is already here. But initially that recognition can be like just such a delicate little thing. It can get blown away by anything. And so, you know, what I'm kind of referring to is the possibility of deepening it, strengthening it, stabilizing it so that it's not so easily blown away.
Yeah, and that's why so much, you know, of the work I do these days is around teaching that a simple process of inquiry, where people can, you know, where you can find your way back to your nature when challenges are here, right?
Yeah.
When difficulties arise. Because we all know about, you know, we can be in stillness and everything is fine, but the moment you go and move in life, you know, nothing is fine and just things arise and everything just happens. And then you want to be able to find that. And you don't want to have to separate, right? And say, well, this is my quiet time, this is my spiritual, because that's, you know, unnatural, right? You know, this is my spiritual and this is my life. So through this simple process of inquiry, you know, we can actually meet what arises, you see, rather than always run away from it. That's what Papaji used to talk about, you know, the dream tiger, you know, and you're still afraid of it, right?
Yeah.
You're still afraid of it. So we can learn to just turn our attention and just say, hey, okay, what's really actually present? Can I be here, right? Can I meet that so my attention doesn't have to go with that?
Yeah, so I think what you're saying is that not only can we learn to bring ourselves back to that if we've been thrown off, but that we can actually develop it so profoundly or stably that we're not thrown off even in the midst of trying circumstances, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And also, you know, in general, you know, the lives are, everybody's lives are so busy right now, right? There's just so much going on and there's so much influences and there's so many things. And we really need to learn to have a little bit more of that, you know, stability or that pull towards inner stillness. Understanding that, you know, everything arises here, that, you know, fulfillment is already present, that we don't really have to, you know, follow things, that we don't really have to run after stuff. It doesn't mean to exclude life, but it means to keep coming to that bottom line that, you know, when you are at rest, when you are still, when you are, you know, when your life is in alignment, you know, the fulfillment is already here, right?
Mm-hmm. What would you say to people who say that that's easier said than done, like the single mom who's got 3 kids and is working very hard to make ends meet, and, you know, who feels like life is just overwhelming her? Could you offer something even for somebody in that kind of state, or does it one have to have kind of more ideal conditions to even begin to consider this?
I would say everybody knows presence. You know, Rick, I would say everybody has experiences of presence. Not everybody recognizes them for what they are, right? So a single mom with 3 kids, you know, that's a lot of work and a lot of, you know, attention that goes into that. But I'm sure there are moments in her life too, you know, where presence is, where she's aware of presence, right? So maybe she can't, you know, stop her life. Maybe she can't devote hours a day to just being quiet. Maybe she can't, you know, but she could start with just recognizing that these moments, even if they are just a split of a second, you see, because that's, again, it's only mind, you know, mind classifies, well, that was really long and that was really short and that's good and that's bad, right? So even if it's just a split of a second that she can recognize and she can say, wow, that's me, you see, that's my nature, that's who I am, right?
And then what can she do to make that deeper or more stable, you know, less easily blown away?
Well, what we really, anybody, mother with 3 children or a saint on the top of the mountain or anything in between, you know, what we really have to recognize, understand, and really get is what causes suffering, right? Because if we don't really understand that, we are still on the quest to change, you know, to change circumstances, to change people, to change situations, to improve life in a way that is external. But if we understand that movement away from our nature is the cause of suffering, then we have a willingness then, because, you know, everything starts with right understanding, right? Once you understand, then you can say, okay, well, I get it. Is there something I can do about it, right? And once we have the understanding, then we also have the willingness to say, wait a minute. When things arise, when things are difficult, and even though it looks like there's so much stuff out there and we can or should be or would be successful if we changed all that, that we have this moment of coming back and saying, wait a minute, let me just see what is actually present, right? What is actually present, you know, because that's where suffering is, right?
Yeah.
What is actually present? Can I be here, right? It's not always easy to do that, but can I be here, right? And that you know, that change of direction, that really changes the direction, because otherwise we are still in the outgoing movement of, if I get it right, then it's all going to get better, right?
Yeah. So, on that point of, you know, changing the whole world in order to make ourselves happy versus, you know, starting at home, I think it was Gandhi or the Dalai Lama or somebody who said it's a lot easier to put shoes on your feet than to pave the earth with leather.
Right, of course. Beautiful. Beautiful. And just that understanding, you know, even in the busyness of life, if we have the right understanding, we can pay attention, you know. It's not a have to or should or must. It's just, well, we could, you know. It's possible. It's a possibility. So,
would you advocate some sort of quiet time or meditation or something like that, sitting in silence, as a sort of blocked out part of your one's day, rather than just trying to remember the silence in the midst of all the activity?
Well, what I always encourage students, you know, what I always encourage is to develop their own personal practice, you know, quote unquote, because practice is also a controversial word. You know, we can maybe talk about it at some point, you know, what practice means. It means a lot of things to a lot of people. There's a lot of misunderstanding. But I always say, develop your own personal practice, which is find the time to be quiet. It's not, you know, do an hour a day or do this or do that, but find a time to be quiet.
Yeah.
find the time to do it. Find the time to possibly do some simple physical activity, you know, a little yoga, a little stretching, a little walking, or something that moves that energy also, because sometimes the patterns, you know, the body mind is so connected, you know, and the patterns can be so solidified, right? Find some time to do inquiry, you know. So everybody in their own capacity, right? Some people do a lot, some people do less, some people do very little, but we all try to do some of that.
Yeah, and even the person whose life is hectic, they find some time to chill out in front of the TV or, you know, do something like that. So it's possible. It's just a matter of what you choose to do with that time, I guess.
Yeah, and I also say to people, start with 5 minutes, you know. Do 5 minutes, you know. Don't do, and you know, don't do something that is unrealistic, you know.
Right.
You know, find something that you can actually do, right? So
yeah. So you've given us some basic points about your teaching, and you said that was just sort of the kernel, the essence of it, and there's more. Perhaps we could elaborate. Well, we'll be elaborating in the course of the interview, but let me just refer to a couple things that I really liked when I listened to about 20 hours worth of your recordings.
Oh, it is. Break.
It was fun. I do it while, you know, cutting the grass and riding my bike and stuff like that. But there are a number of things I really enjoyed, and that's why it was easy to listen to 20 hours worth. For one thing, I really enjoyed the fact that you often tie in the physiology when you talk about this, and not all teachers do that. You know, some of them speak as though we don't have a body, and that what's happening in the nervous system has no bearing on you know, what's happening in our more subjective life. But I think that it's really valuable that you do that. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, and you know, that comes through experience, through many years of working with people, through my own personal experience, and just seeing that there are tools out there right now that maybe we didn't have before, you know. Maybe before it wasn't so, you know, clear or popular or understandable or easy, you know, and that, as you say, we do have a body, right? It's a body mind, and that's, you know, it has, the physiology functions in a certain way. The better, the more we understand that, the less we are in conflict with that, the more we understand that it's just natural, that that's just the way it is, that that's just the way it happens. So, because, you know, so many people have so much judgment on their own experience or other people's experience, but their own most of all, you know. And the more they can understand, the more we can understand that it's just natural, you know, it happens this way. And if they can understand you know, the technical part of it, so to speak, you know, and they can learn to be with it in a more efficient way, I think information is very powerful. You know, information is very useful. There's a lot of good information out there right now. You know, the brain, the nervous system, how it works, you know, the fight or flight, the survival, you know, how much of our experience is guided by that, you know. To really understand that more, I think, you know, very crucial. It's so much easier than to say, let's just be here, you know, because teachers often say, well, just be here, right? Whatever that means, right? And then, and it's, for some people it's easier because they have some training already in being here. For some people it's like, what, you know, what is that? What the hell is that, right? So to understand, you know, how can we use the sensations of the body? How can we use the understanding of the nervous system? How can, you know, to really help ourselves to be here? I think anything that helps, you know, anything that helps is just really useful. So
yeah. I mean, in the Indian tradition, the Vedic tradition, they have this concept of vasanas, you know, which are said to be physiological impressions that correspond with the various conditionings that keep us bound, you know, and so they very much take that into account and say that, you know, that physiological change has to happen. It's not just a thing that's happening in consciousness alone.
Yeah, of course, because when vasana is present, there's a momentum there. There's the momentum of the past, of it not having been experienced. And so it brings with itself its own momentum, and that momentum is what takes our attention, right? That's what we get caught in when it arises, you know. So to have a way to know how to address that better, I think it's very powerful. But there's also another aspect of that, you know, that I'm thinking that initially when we really want to know presence, we really, remove things. We have to go in, so we have to let go of impressions, sensations, feelings, thoughts, we just really, really, narrow down. We just have to go more and more, remove everything or let go of everything, right? But that's just half of it, right? And then let's say by doing that, we really arrived at the fuller realization or awakening to our true nature, right? But that's only a beginning, right? This is not the end. So then we want to come back to the functionality in this body-mind, and that requires a willingness to be present with everything that arises. Otherwise, it becomes a disembodied experience, right? An experience that is just, it's halfway, it's not fully integrated back into this relative reality.
That's very interesting. It pretty much describes the whole course of my experience over the decades where, when I first learned to meditate, there was a sort of a just transcending the body and going beyond and not being sort of tuned into it at all. And these days it's more like a kind of a CAT scan when I meditate, where there's this kind of the awareness or the attention continues to be brought to different parts of the physiology which I experience as kind of blockages, and then those dissolve, and then another one, and then that dissolves, and it's more like a kind of an integration on the physical level that seems to be taking place.
Yeah, because first we have to let go of everything, and then we need to come back to it just in a different way, you see, because the real awakening or the real realization is not about avoidance, right?
Right.
It's not about avoidance. It's about discrimination, So how can we now, from this new perspective, come to everything and really, embody life or embrace life, but with this discrimination present, with this knowing present, right?
So when you were talking earlier about taking a little time out, maybe even 5 minutes or whatever, to just have sort of exclusive focus on an inquiry process, would that inquiry process possibly include a kind of a tuning into what's going on in the body, as opposed to just a mental procedure? There's a lot. When I encourage people to sit, there's many different things I encourage them to do that for. If you can spend some time in quiet, in real stillness, beautiful, right? When we are sitting with what has arisen and it's taking our attention, I always ask, the inquiry process that I teach, I always say inquiry is not a mental exercise, right? It's not about thinking. It's really about changing the direction of your looking, right? Instead of looking into the outer and the thoughts, feelings, emotions, you look into where there is the cause of suffering, right? So to get there, though, practically, I always encourage people, and this is the inquiry process is so much based on physical, noticing the sensations of your body, of really noticing what's actually present. Right, because there is, there's so much going on in the mental. It's absolutely, useless to even try to focus on that. Right, there's so much going on in the emotional that even though that's already closer to our natural state, but it's potentially volatile, and if we're not careful, it's going to take us right back into the story, of what's going on, and then there is the sensation of the body, which is just so much more slower, and is so much more accessible that we can use it for our entryway to presence, right? Yeah.
If we are willing to pay our attention to it really in a pure way,
So to take a hypothetical example, let's say somebody's boyfriend or girlfriend just broke up with them, and they're very upset, and they could sit and do a sort of inquiry process. So they could sit there thinking, oh, what a jerk he is or she is, or whatever. That would be the mental level. Or they could just be sitting there and feeling all these emotions of loneliness and sadness. Or they could tune into the physiology and get down to what's really being felt on that level.
Beautiful, beautiful. And they could not, because the tendency, or the, you know, the movement oftentimes is so much into the story, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
So when you're sitting and you're just really noticing what is present in your body, that's something you can actually be with, you see? Mm-hmm. You can't be with the thoughts. You can't be with that amount of emotion that is still fueled by some kind of story, right?
Right.
But you can be, you know, with the sensation in your body, and by doing that, you actually coming or bringing yourself back to the present, right?
Mm-hmm. That's good. One word that I heard you use a lot, which I really appreciated, was tenderness. There's a lot of emphasis on the word tenderness, and let's talk about that for a few minutes. Perhaps we can define, or maybe I should just let you start by defining in what sense you use that word.
You know, tenderness is natural. When we are in our natural state, you know, when we are at rest, when we are not struggling with what is here, where there's no conflict, tenderness is naturally present, right? It's just you know, it's just what is, right? It's just how we really are. Most of the, you know, you naturally experience tenderness when you are in a quiet place. You know, if anything was to, if you're quiet and there's nothing going on, you probably wouldn't experience anything. But let's say something comes into the field of your experience, you would most likely experience tenderness towards that when you are really, really at rest, right? Now, in the process of conditioning, which is, you know, when I say conditioning, I mean an inability to be here. You know, when I say conditioning, is the habits that we learned to avoid our true nature, right? So in the process of conditioning, we moved away from tenderness, right? We actually invested a lot into harshness, into holding, into being tough. You know, you just, you know, you have to toughen up. You have to move through it. You know, you have to. There's a lot of stuff out there, you know, conditioning-wise, that just tells us to deny what is actually present, right? So.
Well, I was just going to say, well, the word, it seems that the world tends to coarsen us. You know, it's a big, gross world in a sense. And, you know, we get out there, we have to work hard, we have to do this and that. And the tenderness kind of gets covered over with a thick skin of harshness or coarseness,
right.
Involuntarily almost,
right.
You know?
Yeah, that's what I mean, conditioning. But there's a difference between, you know, having a certain sense of boundary when we are existing in the world, and having to toughen up the inner, you see, having to toughen up that access to your true nature, you know. Just that's oftentimes a survival, you know, mechanism or a strategy that, you know, gets developed over time, right? As we are living in the body mind, the strategy of, you know, you have to toughen up because it's just unsafe, but that really just cuts down on the natural sense of tenderness too, right?
But the word strategy makes it sound volitional, like, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get tough so that I can protect myself. But it almost seems that it happens involuntarily. And to take an extreme example, I mean, these soldiers who go over to Iraq and Afghanistan, you know, and they're bombarded with such a stressful situation, then they all come back with PTSD, you know, post-traumatic stress disorder, where there's been an extreme sort of accumulation of stress and coarsening, and quite the opposite of tenderness. So.
Well, when I Rick, you know, it's a little different what I speak. It's a little different, and it's really not so much what happens. It's more how we are with what is here. You see, how we are with what is here. You know, because I understand PTSD and I understand harshness and I understand things that happen, but and I agree with you, the voluntarily, involuntarily, because it involuntarily the body, mind, nervous system responds in a certain way, but then we solidify in that response, you see. Then we believe that, then we say, well, this is how it is, right? And that's not really the truth, right? This is not how it is. It's just that in certain situations, your body, mind, your physiology is going to respond in a certain way, naturally, obviously, of course, right? However, if that response gets solidified and we believe in it, then we start to believe that we have to protect. You see, that on the inner, I'm talking on the inner, I'm not talking be indiscriminative with everything and everybody in the world. That's not what I'm saying, right? I'm just saying on the inner, you know, are you at rest, you see? Are you at rest, or are you suffering? Or are you holding something, right? Because if you're holding something, that's going to cause suffering, no matter what it is. PTSD, you know, a challenging experience, which I have a lot of experience myself, you know, through my own illness. How are you with that? Are you at rest with that? Can you be here with it, or are you suffering, right? When it's happening, right? It's still happening, you know, we can't avoid that, right?
So do you think that it would be possible for, let's say that let's say the army hires Neelam to train the soldiers who are going over to Iraq and Afghanistan to better deal with the stress they're going to encounter by learning to kind of just what you just said, to sort of be with it, to not buy into the belief of so-and-so. Is that possible, or is it not fair to take such an extreme example?
I don't know that they would want to go then if I was sitting with them.
Good point.
I don't know if anybody in their right mind would actually want to do that, you know. So if the army hires me, that's probably the end of the army, right?
Good. I hope they hire you.
But you know, I want to say something about the tenderness, because so much, you know, in our conditioning, this harshness, right? Mm-hmm. And even the spiritual practice can become very harsh.
Yeah.
And the reason why I say so much tenderness, you know, because even people, when they sit with what has arisen, they say, okay, are you able to be here? All right. What's wrong with you? Why can't you do it?
Yeah, it's like,
you know,
whoa.
No, that's the inner. That's their inner, right? That's their inner. And I say, well, tenderness is natural, you see. Mm-hmm. So discriminate within. See that when you are harsh, when you are, you know, tough with yourself, even if it's about spiritual practice, then it's useless. Then it's the past, you see. Then it's not natural. Then it's not going to help you, right? It's not going to do anything for you. So that's the level of discrimination I would like for everybody to have, you know, like, wow, tenderness, you know, if it means that going to sleep right now is the most tender thing to do, then that's what's going to help you the most, you see. Mm-hmm. It's not going to help you to sit there and toughen it out, right?
Yeah. So perhaps we could say that you're warning against straining in the name of naturalness or tenderness. You know, one shouldn't strain. One should just be natural.
Natural, right.
Yeah.
And going back to natural, because, you know, so much we spend in self-hatred. So much people spend in self-hatred, you know, in little ways and in big ways, you know. So that's just not productive, right? Not productive. But going back to your example, you know, of the army and the PTSD, and, you know, let's say hypothetically, because I don't really, you know, it's so hard to judge anybody else's experience, or gauge, not judge, but gauge anybody else's experience. But hypothetically, if consciousness is really used to resting, if it's really so much more conditioned to just be in its own natural state, when these difficult, challenging experiences come in, they are most likely we are going to be much easier with that, you see?
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's going to be nice. I'm not saying it's going to be pleasant. I'm just saying there's a possibility to remain in that tenderness with that, you see, which is huge, which is, I think, humongous, because that means there's no suffering.
Yeah. Well, think of the Bhagavad Gita as an example. I mean, Arjuna was saying, I'm going to go get these guys, and Krishna then reminded him of his mother, and that brought this wave of tenderness, and he just then he thought, I can't fight at all, and then Krishna kind of got him to the point where he would,
right.
Yeah, I still have to do it, but here, do it well established in presence, you know, then you'll be okay.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. I think a synonym we could use for tenderness, though, which has a negative connotation, might be vulnerability. You know, that if one might think that if one is too tender, then one is going to be vulnerable.
You know, vulnerability, but I would say, again, these are inner places. You know, I would say vulnerability to the human condition. Really understanding, you know, that there are limits to the body mind, that there are limits to this experience, that there are certain things that do cause harm, that there are certain things that are going to have consequences, you know, and not in the conditioned way, consequences like we were taught, you know, by our parents, but real, you know, certain things do cause harm. That's the truth of it, right?
Sure.
So if we have a real vulnerability to the human condition, you know, to really understand, wow, this is really fragile, this situation, you know, this situation is fragile. This is the truth of it, right? Can we live in that? Not in some idea of vulnerability that means, you know, I am exposing my feelings to everything and everybody whenever I feel like it. That's not the kind of vulnerability or tenderness that I'm speaking about, right? And actually, you know, when you are tender, when you are in that right relationship with what is here, then you're so much stronger, you see. Then you're so much stronger than anything or anybody else because you're real. You can really be with that. And that's like, whew, you know, powerful in the universe, right? If that happens. So
somehow when you said that, I was reminded of the image, which I've seen many times, of a little tender weed or plant pushing itself right up through the asphalt and, you know, coming up through this hard thing.
I know. And the winds blow and the cars go and everything, and it's still there, you know. It's the true vulnerability, right?
Yeah.
It's the true softness.
Now, in your own case, you know, you haven't been secretive about the fact that you've had health challenges and you're sensitive to electronics and things like that. Could that somehow be a phase that you're going through because of the tenderness? It's made you vulnerable, and that you might come somehow eventually toughen up without losing the vulnerability and thereby not have these challenges? Or am I off the mark on that?
I wouldn't say that. And you know, it's very hard to put the illness in the context because there are some real physiological components here that really, you know, they will have to get into a lengthy conversation. But, you know, in truth, what I always believe and what I always see, that everything happens for a reason.
Yeah.
And if there is a level of transformation that needs to happen, and for some reason, this is how it's happening, you know, this is how it needs to work itself through, you know, and I can't really, you know, again, it will be a lengthy conversation if I would start to get into all the details, you know. I can't really say much more about it other than there's a level of transformation, there's a level of patterning that needs to let go, you know, and for some reason this is how it's choosing to work itself out, you know. So.
Yeah, well, you know, I've interviewed a number of people who've said a similar thing, that they've really gone through a sort of a physiological hell in the process of undergoing a transformation. And even like, you know, St. Francis of Assisi, he went through this disease and he almost died, and then when he finally came out of it, he was like St. Francis of Assisi. He woke up in this spiritual reason. So it almost seems both in the traditional literature and in contemporary examples that not always, but sometimes people have to go through a real meat grinder physiologically and in order to facilitate or complete some sort of transformation that's taking place.
And also, you know, what I'm learning in the midst of that, I don't think I could learn in any other way, you see. So if this body mind, if this vehicle is meant to serve in a certain way, you know, if it's meant to share in a certain way, and that is part of that information, then I can tell you there is a lot of information here, you know, that wouldn't be there because, you know, if it was happening in any other way. So.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, you quoted, I think Papaji as saying, well, this is more with relationship to the psyche, but you quoted him as saying, the deeper the psychological wounding, the deeper the realization. And in this case, we're talking about a physiological, you know, travail that you're going through. But do you somehow feel like this process you're going through is conducive to deepening your realization? You
know, I don't really hold it in any particular way. Nor do I hold the realization in any particular way. You know, I don't really measure. There's no measurement, right? You know, so I can't tell. You know what I mean? I'm not really thinking about it like that. I'm not really holding it like that. So it's very hard to answer that question. All I can tell you is what I am learning from it, what I'm seeing is so unbelievable in a way, you know. It's so different, and it's so, you know, I don't know that there would have been any other way to see that, you know. So
is it possible to put that into words, what you're learning, or is it more of a visceral kind of thing that you couldn't really articulate?
Again, it's so much, you know, that we could probably talk for several hours about it, you know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if there's anything, you know, easy that I could. Well, first of all, just the vulnerability of the human body, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just the real vulnerability of that, right? And at the same time, a real, you know, ongoing sense, which I can't say, you know, it wasn't there before, but a real ongoing sense that everything is okay the way it is. You see?
Yeah.
That there's just nothing that can shake that, you know, that can move that, that there's no circumstance, no situation, no, you know, body-mind condition that can really change that or shake that. So
yeah, I think sometimes people hear that phrase, everything is okay the way it is, and it sounds to them to be sort of passive or defeatist or, you know, lacking in motivation. But I think the way you mean it, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's a sort of a divine intelligence that orchestrates our lives, that orchestrates the universe, and we can trust in that to have our best interests in mind ultimately.
well, when I say, you know, everything is okay the way it is, I mean, in this moment, as you're sitting here, and you can check, and, you know, we can just check on that. In this moment, when you really pay attention, when you for a moment just notice, you know, what is here, then does anything have to be different?
No?
No.
Yeah.
No.
Now, what if you had a severe toothache? Would anything have to be different?
That's the mind, Rick. That's
Okay.
the mind, right? The mind goes, well, what if, right?
Yeah.
But before we go there, you know, what you're recognizing right now is it's what is really the you know, symptom of our natural state.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in truth, in reality, everything is okay the way it is. That's the truth, right?
Yeah.
It's not, you don't want to translate it into the ego place that says, oh, things are fine, no problem, we can do it, you know, it's just all okay. That's not what I'm saying, right? It's a real deep recognition that everything is okay the way it is just because, you see. Mm-hmm. That's the truth, right? So what would that mean if we really allowed it? Because passive is a story, you know, again, that's a story. Oh, okay, it's just a passive. What it would really mean is, it would mean you are okay the way you are. Nothing has to change, right? Your life is okay the way it is. Mm-hmm. Nothing has to change. Everybody is okay the way they are, right? Nothing has to change. The world is okay the way they are, or the way it is, right? Nothing has to change. And is that powerful, you know? Is that powerful? If we just really would allow that, you know?
And yes, and to me that doesn't preclude going out and, you know, trying to solve this problem, or, you know, working at your job, or improving your life in various ways, or helping the suffering, or it's like it doesn't mean it's like there's a simultaneous paradoxical kind of acceptance and dwelling in everything being okay the way it is, which is not incompatible with improving things in various ways.
Well, change is part of life, and it doesn't mean you're not going to change things. It only means what I'm always interested in is, where are you coming from? Mm-hmm. Right? Because if we talk about okayness, then it gives us you know, a touchstone. That's reality.
Right.
So if you are, in all honesty, let's say something happened in your life right now, you know, I don't know, something happened and you are just struggling with it, and in all honesty, you would ask yourself, is that okay that that's happening right now? Yeah. And most likely your answer will be no. Then we know the gap between truth and reality and where you are, you see? Mm-hmm. And by knowing that gap, we know that we can do something about it, you see? Yeah. So we don't have to suffer, right? So much change happens from a place of not okayness. Mm-hmm. When you move from a place of not okayness, you do change, but you create more of the same, which is not okayness, right? Yeah. Because the change is not real. You know, the change is based on your body, mind, ego idea of what's supposed to be. The change is not a real movement that happens in presence, right? So that understanding of okayness is not there to justify things. It's not there to say everything is okay, that means we don't have to do anything, we are all fine and it's all fine. It only means, you know, oh, I have a reference point. I have a place to go because the mind is so deceptive. When things are here, you know, you can tell yourself that you are okay. But in truth, you will check and you will go like, whoa, I'm not okay. And that means this is where I am at and this is where reality is, you know. Can I be here, right?
Yeah.
Can I be here? Which is just cuts down on so much unnecessary stuff, you know, just unnecessary stuff.
Well, to take an example, I mean, we just have had a lot of tornadoes in the Midwest, and theoretically our house could have gotten hit by a tornado last night. And I can honestly say that if that had happened throughout that experience, there would have been a kind of a foundation of everything is okay, even though this is happening. And then there also would have been the motivation to clean up, contact the insurance agency, do all the things that needed to be done. But there's always a dimension or an element or a level of one's life in which everything is okay regardless of what's happening, at least in my experience so far.
Exactly. And if you were to be not okay with that, you will be suffering, and then your action will be so different. You still will have to clean up.
Right.
But you will be in such a worse shape, you see.
Yeah, yeah, so I see what you're saying.
It will be such a much more difficult experience. So.
Yeah. No, that's really good, you know, because I think sometimes people hear that teaching, and in fact there's a teacher whom I was going to interview, and he speaks a lot like this, and some other guy was getting in touch with me and saying, I hate that. I want to come on the week after that guy and refute him, you know, because I feel it seems so lacking in compassion and so on. But I think if it's understood in the proper context, it's not at all devoid of compassion.
Well, because that kind of okayness means what it means, translation means everything arises here.
Yes.
That's the truth. We can't avoid, you know. Can I avoid the body-mind experience that I have been going through over the last several years? No. Can I be in struggle with it? Sure. Would that be easier for me? No. Can I be at rest here? Sure. You know, does that make it easier? Definitely. Right? Yeah. So that's all it means, okayness. You know, it doesn't mean some kind of idea, you know. So.
No, that's really good. I'm glad we dwelt on that point a little bit. So, let's shift gears and let's talk a little bit about awakening. We throw the term around a lot, awakening, enlightenment, and so on. How do you define those terms?
Well, first of all, when I say awake, I mean when I say, you know, our nature, who we are, that's awake, right? So every moment you are aware of that, that's awake.
And what are you aware of, just for the sake of everyone listening? If you're aware of your nature, who you are, what is it you're aware of?
Stillness, presence, rest, God, being, you know, whatever you call it. In no mind, you know, the place of no identification, just these moments of just, space, right? Yeah. Clarity, you know, just here, right? So.
And is it sufficient for the situation to be that a sense of individuality is aware deep down of some presence or stillness, or is it really that one has to, the whole identity has to shift?
No, the sense of individuality has to disappear, even if it's just for a second, right?
Right.
That's what I call awake, because then there's nobody there to really perceive that. It just happens, right?
Yeah.
Now, though, you know, for many of us, it takes in the beginning, we will be aware of these moments, but then we will contract back into the sense of identity, right? You know, when we first become more consciously aware of these moments, because everybody has these moments, right? Everybody has them, it's just nobody really pays attention and knows what they are, right? But then when we more consciously become aware of it, you know, it happens and it doesn't happen. That's what it looks like, right? It happens and then it doesn't happen because we contract back into the sense of identity again, right?
Yeah.
And so in the process of awakening, if we can call it that, most of the time we'll be going back and forth between those for quite a while. You know, nobody knows for how long, right? Because there's no like measurement of that again, right?
Right.
But there will be this like, oh my, wow, this is amazing. You know, like look at Rumi, you know, like just read Rumi's, you know, poetry and see the process of just falling in love, being totally enticed by the beloved, right? Being, you know, longing for it and desiring it, and eventually just being it, right? So that's a very, very, you know, step-by-step process of awakening, really. So we go back and forth between these realizations and recognitions, and then contraction into the body-mind, and you know, and so it gets more and more subtle. You know, we can even still be in expanded states of consciousness, in bliss, and I mean just wholly amazing, beautiful things, and there is still a sense of identity present, right? Until eventually something happens. This is that moment when you know, that sense of identity where it burns through, and we are just simply unequivocally aware that who we are is just none of that, right? That none of that is who we really are. And once that happens, that doesn't go away, right?
Right.
Because now something has happened, and as before, the sense of, you know, identity was so focused on the body mind, like we would just, you know, when you would close your eyes, you would just go back to the sense of your body. Now when you are quiet, what you go back to is vastness, right?
Right.
It's present. It's just natural. This is not, nobody's doing it, but it's just like something has shifted in the ground, you know, of our experience, right? It's no more just relating to this. This is just part of it, right?
If both things are you saying that one completely gets to a point in which there's no resurrection or of a sense of individuality or anything, or are you saying that the primary identification is with the vastness, and on the surface or in some kind of utilitarian way there's the individuality and all of its, you know,
of course,
likes and dislikes and quirks and whatnot.
Yeah, the individuality doesn't disappear necessarily, but there is really not, but that ground of experience has changed. It's
takes
not
a back
anymore,
seat, so to speak.
Exactly. It's not anymore just, oh, this is me. It's like now this is me, right?
Yeah.
Everything is me, right? Everything is me. And then there is that sense of individuality still here too, of course.
Yeah, I have a friend named Bob, and he said that he underwent a profound shift at one point. He said prior to that, it was always sort of Bob having the experience of consciousness, and then after that, it was consciousness having the experience of Bob.
Exactly. Yeah, I said you walk in like this, you know, and then you walk out like that, and it's like it's nothing really changed, but so dramatically changed, you know. So
yeah, when we use the word dramatic, it brings up the point that in some cases it seems for some people this sort of shift is very gradual, so much so that they hardly notice it, and other people it's this, you know, night and day, profound, dramatic shift. Would you agree with that in your experience as a teacher? And
what I see more is that, you know, that there is a moment in which that the realization really happens. However, that moment can be a very subtle experience.
Right.
For some of us, you know, again, spiritual experiences or you know, the amounts of it and all that has nothing to do with awakening, right? That just is individual. For some people it happens like that. For some people it happens like something different. It doesn't really matter. So the shift itself for some of us can be, wow, you know, just fireworks. And for some of us it's going to be like, oh, that's it? Wow, that's amazing, right? So, but still there is a recognition there, because otherwise before there's still this going, you know, we are still going to it, you know. It's like, oh yeah, that's a nice place, I want to go there, you know. And there's like, well, there's no going because it's here, right? Because everything is here. So
do you mind talking about your own path a little bit? You know, were you a fireworks lady, or were you a subtle gradual, or, you know, did you go through years of on again, off again, got it, I lost it, or what?
Again, a long story, so, you know, I'm going to try to make it really short here. But you know, at a certain point in my life, for a long time I wasn't even aware that I'm on a spiritual path. I am sure that that's true for many people. You know, I wasn't even aware. However, there was that momentum that was moving me in a certain direction, which I then recognized later, right? Later. And so at some point there is, you know, this like, oh, there is something out there and I really want that, but I don't even know what it is and I don't even have a name for it, or I don't even have, you know, I don't know what path is or anything, right? And then eventually, you know, as it quickens, as it comes more to the, you know, to the actual experience of it, I just started to have different experiences. You know, I just started to have different experiences that were so unusual that I didn't know what they were. I didn't know where they were coming from. At that time, they were really scary. You know, they were terrifying because you go out on a street and you suddenly see people's past lives and their karma and their different things. I mean, just, you know, something opens and you're just suddenly in this like totally different world and you go, what the, you know, what the hell is happening, right?
And you hadn't been doing any spiritual practices or anything. This was just happening.
Not spiritual per se, you know. I was doing, there was some kind of Kundalini kind of thing, yoga, or I don't know, remember exactly. There was something, but there wasn't really spiritual per se. Suddenly, boom, something happens and this body mind is just starting to experience a lot of expansion and a lot of, you know, visual and sensory experiences. And, you know, there's like not able to sleep. There's just a lot of energy, just transformation going on. It's like there's no understanding whatsoever. And then I started to look for a teacher. You know, I started to look for somebody, and I go to these Buddhist places, and you know, and they say, well, it's just, you know, whatever is happening, just be here and just do these practices, you know, and I'm there, you know, trying to do visualization, and I just can't, because every time I sit quiet, I just go into total bliss, you know. So there's like nothing, there's like no momentum towards that, you know.
Yeah.
So finally I go like, well, I don't think this is working, you know, because I'm just laughing most of the time, because I just can't make myself, you know, go there. So
right.
So, and eventually, you know, coming more in touch with Ramana and reading some writings of Ramana, but still really not fully trusting, you see, not being able to fully trust. So then really looking for a physical teacher, and then meeting another teacher before I met Papaji, and just spending some time, a couple of years involved in this, and again spending endless hours just in bliss and meditation, right? Mm-hmm. But the moment, you know, I would get up, there will be suffering.
Yeah.
And by that time, the change will be so profound from, you know, the expanded states and the blissful states to the suffering states that I just felt like I'm going crazy, I think.
Wow. It's interesting. Know? So it was a complete on-off, black-white kind of shift, huh? It wasn't like some of the bliss carried over into your daily life?
Some of it did, but there was such a huge difference between me just sitting there. I could sit for hours in bliss, and then I would get up and then I'll be like, what? This is just, you know, suffering, right?
Yeah.
And then I remember lying down at some point and this thought arose that said, you know, I want to find somebody who is going to show me out of this. You know, and a week later I was in Satsang. Never heard about Satsang, never knew anything about it. A week later somebody brings a flyer to my house about Satsang, you know, and it's a flyer of a Satsang with Gangaji, and I'm reading it and I'm just thinking, that's interesting. This woman didn't spend like, you know, millions of years sitting in, I mean, I don't know that, but she didn't spend years in this lifetime sitting in a monastery, you know. So eventually I go there, and so goes from there, you know. Shall I tell you more? Or?
Yeah, please. This is interesting.
So you know, I go to Satsang with Gangaji, and in the beginning, there's just so much love in that place that there's a total contraction, you know, in my body, and just goes like, just no way, I'm just not going there. So I just don't go. And at that time, she used to travel like for a month at a time. So after a few days, I go like, well, you know, maybe let's try it again. So I go there, and just instantaneous almost, my mind drops, and it's just total absolute stillness, you know, and just bliss, and just like nothing ever happened, you know. So I write her a letter, she invites me, we talk, you know, and all that. And then somewhere halfway through, she always has had Papaji's picture with her, you know, and somewhere halfway through I suddenly see Papaji, you know, which I didn't see before.
The picture, you mean?
Yeah, but you know, the picture was there all the time, but I just didn't see it.
Right.
You know, how you suddenly like see
Mm-hmm.
something. And I recognize in that moment, this is my teacher and that's where I have to go, and that's it, you know. So so about 6 months later, I'm in India with Papaji, and you know, just that's how it went.
And so how long did you have to be with Papaji before this phase of, you know, either bliss or suffering, ended, and it sort of settled down?
What was interesting is that initially when I saw Papaji, I just went like, wow, this is just wholly unbelievable, and this is amazing, and it's unbelievable that that exists, you know, in a human form, that that exists.
Mm-hmm.
However, then, you know, the first month there was like, okay, well, I have had all these experiences already. See, still a very subtle veil of the ego, you know, that would just sit there. Well, you know, what are you going to show me, right? Here I am, right? I have already experienced so much, you know. And of course, slowly realizing with some help, you know, that this is just wrong. This is not the right way to be there, you know. And then something drops inside, and I recognize that I just have to fully give myself to it, you know. Just give myself to it, and I do. I give myself whatever arises for me to do. Write him a letter, talk to him, do this or do that, whatever it is. I just follow that, you know, and I follow that to the point, to the place where, you know, I ask him at some point, can I come and sit close near to him when he gives satsang? And he says, okay. And I go there and sit there, you know, with my eyes closed, and I hear what he's saying to everybody, you know. And this has been months already. I'm there for months, 2 or 3 months already. I have heard him speak, right? But I'm hearing, for the first time, I'm really hearing on the inner, you know, what he says to everybody. And for the first time, I really recognize what he's speaking is true, you know. This is just the truth, you know. And so something relaxes in my own body, mind, you know. We can say trust or whatever. Something happens, you know. And that very day I go to, you know, I'm going out for dinner, and suddenly this huge fear of death arises, you know. And I just go like, no way. So I'm just going to, you know, have the dinner and, you know, sit there with some friends and have the dinner, and I'm just, and the fear of death is just like right here, you know, just totally present. And I'm just like, I'm not going there, right? And so, and then I walk out of the dinner, you know, and 3 little Indian girls come up to me, just in the middle of the street, you know, there I am walking, and they come up, and each has a little flower, and they just give it to me silently, you know, each just gives me the little flower, and, you know, and they don't say anything, we can't speak, you know, and my heart just totally opens, you know, and just breaks, and I just go like, okay, I'm just going to go home and just sit, you know, and just see what happens. So there I am, you know.
So you went home and you sat. Home, you mean home in Lucknow, not home.
In Lucknow, right.
Yeah.
I'm just going to go and just sit, you know, and I sit, and, you know, that just takes a second, you know, and that there's that huge desire to just run and be with Papaji and sit at his feet, you know, and that fear of death just arises and just sweeps through the body. And there I'm sitting, and, you know, still with my eyes open, I can see everything disappearing, you know, just what we see, what we, you know, normally relate to as reality, everything disappears, and there's just, you know, total stillness, and there's just a total, you know, just, you know, what I can't describe, you know, undescribable. So.
And that was it? I mean, would you consider that moment to have been the shift, or is it more gradations than that?
You know, because that when it happened, it was just timeless, and, you know, and it took a long time to come to the sense of the body mind, and whatever else was happening, you know, that took its time. And then, you know, I have written Papaji a letter about it. So the next day I'm going to satsang with this letter, and, you know, I walk into satsang, and suddenly I realize everything is me. You see, Papaji is me, everything is me. There's really no separation, you see. So from that moment on, I am not saying that that's the end of the embodiment. I'm just saying from that moment on, there's just no doubt or no question about that. So
yeah, it was a very significant milestone, you could say.
yeah, because
Yeah.
that's that moment on, then you know what I know is everything is okay the way it is, you know. Truth is our nature, presence is our nature, this everything is here, I'm everything, you know, there's really no separation, and that's, you know, that's it, right?
Was there some profundity or fullness to the experience at that point there with Papaji and in the midst of that that transition, which tended to fade over time, or would you say even the opposite, that it's enriched or matured over time? And,
No,
and
you know, there was a certain fullness and a certain, you know, first of all, the body mind was challenged by the experience. There was such a tremendous shift and such a tremendous amount of energy that, you know, there were just some physical things that were going on that just challenged the body, right? And it eventually got used to that. And I would say, though, maybe there was a couple of years of just real expanded state, right?
yeah.
Which then eventually gradually settled, you know. It settled into more of a sense of just, you know, fulfillment, right? Or just, you know, I don't know, rest, you know. So at some point it just so became clear, you know, even more again, it's not about states, right? Even that expansion is just really what the, you know, what the body mind goes through. It's not the essence, it's not the core of the experience.
Yeah, this point about states, it's a kind of a point of debate in many spiritual circles, and even among myself and a friend who is a student of yours or has been. Ramana said at one point, I came across a quote, that there are no levels of awareness, but there are levels of experience. And I think that's where the confusion arises. You know, awareness itself is just an homogeneous wholeness, but experience, the degree to which one embodies awareness, then it seems like there's no end to the I was kind of saying this in the very beginning of the interview, no end to the embodiment, or to the integration, or to the fullness with which that can be lived or expressed. Would you agree or no?
Let's clarify Ramana.
Okay, please.
Let's clarify Ramana, because you know what he just simply said, set a stage for the levels of levels. See, words are just so difficult because we just start to interpret that.
Yeah.
Basically said, okay, realization is one you know, station in this, right? But what he also said, and this is what we have to remember, because that's where we get into argument, what he also said, you know, once realization happens, there is no more willful volition.
Right.
When a true realization happens, there is no more willful volition. So there isn't anybody there who can desire anymore for anything else.
Right.
And he said, you know, based on the karma, the individual karma, there will be a momentum from the past that would bring certain individuals, call them, to a certain level of awareness after realization, but that has nothing to do with our normal, you know, perception or understanding of, okay, well, realization is here, now what's next, right? What can we do now to, you know, because realization means that willful volition has ended, right?
So if I understand what you just said, there may be further maturation into more kind of complete levels of awareness or realization or whatever, but it's not by virtue of some individual motivation or volition that happens. It has to just do with one's karma, one's dharma, whatever.
Exactly, and I would not even say more complete, because realization, that's it. Right. That's what he's saying. But some, you know, again, individuals would reach a different level of awareness, and that's predestined, right? This is not something that can be done, that can be desired, that, you know, desire itself is the contradiction to that, right?
Yeah. So perhaps it has to do with what one's kind of destiny is as a, you know, tool of the divine or whatever. But like, so would you say that someone like someone like Ramana or Papaji or whatever, what might be an example of someone whose destiny was such that they reached a more, I have to choose my words very carefully.
I know, because that's the trouble, you know, because we have already so much terminology and we already have so many ideas. We do have to be careful. You're right.
Well, think of this as a metaphor.
Maybe Kabir, who was really in the transcended state, you know, who was really living in the transcended state. Maybe Kabir, that's something that's somebody that I can say, you know, you know.
Well, here's a metaphor that might help us. Let's say you have a Christmas tree bulb, little light bulb, and it's plugged into the 120 volt circuit in your house, and then you have a spotlight out in the driveway that's maybe, you know, 300 watts or something, and it's really bright. They're both of those bulbs, so to speak, appreciate the same electrical field, but one of them shines more brightly because that's its function.
But I want to make it more practical. Is that okay?
Sure, please.
Because you know because this is something we don't have any control over.
Right.
Nobody knows that, and nobody has any control over that. That either happened or it didn't. That's either happening or not. You know.
Yeah.
Is it a huge light or is it a small light bulb?
Right.
Nobody knows.
So if you're born a little Christmas bulb, you're going to be a Christmas bulb appreciating the electrical field, and if you're a spotlight, you're going to be a spotlight. But both of them are plugged into the same source, so to speak.
Exactly. But what we can do, because this is nothing we can do about that, right?
Right.
What we can do, and this is really, you know, I really stress the need and the necessity for the process of embodiment, right? I really see that the awakening, as it is the end of a certain part of our journey, is really a beginning. It's really just an entry point into reality, right?
Yeah.
Into truth. So because this, where we end up on this spectrum between a tiny bulb and a huge, you know, thing, I mean, nobody knows, and who cares, right? This is just what's happening, right?
Yeah.
This is just what's going to happen or not, right? But what we can do is we can really at every moment remain in the awareness of, am I at rest or am I suffering?
Right.
And that's something we can do, right? Because we don't know when tendencies are going to arise. We don't know what circumstances are going to bring that up. We don't know, you know, awakening is not something, you know, it's not some kind of experience that we can hold on to. And I have seen that being held on to. And I have experienced that for a very short time in my own experience, a tendency to, maybe want to stay here. No, really not. It's not worth, right? There's nowhere to stay. There's nowhere to be, you know. This is uninteresting, right? Not really. But but we have the capacity to remain in the total honesty, you see, in the total truthfulness, in the total openness, in the total vulnerability of where we really are, you see. That's what we can do. That's what we can do, right? We can't do anything else, you know, but we can this, you know, so.
So you preface what you just said by saying that, you know, realization is, in one sense, the end of the journey, but it's in the other sense the beginning of the journey, because there begins the real process of embodiment. So was what you said after that in the last minute or two an explanation of what you mean by embodiment? And if not, what do you mean by it?
This is a very simplified explanation, of course, because, you know, somebody asked Papaji, do you still have to be vigilant?
Yes.
And he said, with every breath. Right? Because, you know, you don't know. Nobody knows, right? What you know, there's no end. You know, end is an idea, right? End is a story. So the embodiment is a real truthful living of what we know is true. And that includes body, mind, emotion, sensation, expression in the world. It includes everything, right? That all your interactions are really in congruency with what you know, right? With what you really know, not what you think, right?
And does it eventually become sort of second nature, like riding a bicycle? I mean, you might say, well, do you have to continue to balance? Of course, every moment while I'm riding the bicycle, but it becomes so automatic that I don't even think about it.
I would say in my experience, you know, because presence is your nature, so there's nothing you have to do about that ever, right?
Right.
However, you know, in my own experience, there's a lot of stillness, right?
Mm-hmm.
However, there are times that past is present, and boy, am I aware of that when that happens, right? So now the question is there still, you know, an ongoing willingness to just be here?
Mm.
Right?
And
Because
when you say past is present, which I heard you say many times in the recordings, what you mean is past conditioning is coming up in the present and having its influence. Is that what you mean by that? Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
That's what I mean by past is present, that the past arises here, and it is, and we are aware of it, and now we can either be here or not, right?
Mm.
So it seems, right?
Mm. Yeah, so we have a, like with Papaji's vigilance point, we have the choice to sort of, or the need to be vigilant when the past exerts its influence so as not to be swayed by it. So is that what you're saying?
So what I mean, because, you know, again, we are getting into the hard words territory, like choice, you know.
Yeah, I know.
That's always a point
Tricky.
of intention, you know. But past is present, and can you remain in surrender, you know?
Mm.
Can you really remain in surrender no matter what, you know, no matter what? And sometimes it's difficult, of course, you know. That's why it's called past, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it has its own moment, and it has its own momentum and its own importance, right? That wants to still, you know, tell you that maybe there is something to listen to, right?
Yeah. And so it's interesting that you use the word surrender with reference to that. So let's say a past tendency is coming up and causing us, tempting us to behave in a certain way. You're saying that surrender is somehow, we've used two words here, surrender and vigilance. How do both of those things play into not being controlled by past conditioning?
When past is present, we can either be here or not, right?
Uh-huh.
So,
we could lose our grounding in presence or not.
Yeah,
I see.
yeah. And we can be here, and being here sometimes means, oftentimes, to experience something that is difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the reason past is still active, right? Because it has not been experienced before. You know, if it has not been experienced before, it has still momentum. It still appears as if it was vital and important and useful in some way. So seeing that, recognizing that, and saying, okay, can I be here, sometimes means experiencing things that are difficult, right? Mm-hmm. Because that's what has not been experienced. And that's though what would allow us to remain in our nature, right?
And when we do that, does it take the steam out of that past influence a little bit, so that next time, if there is a next time, it's not going to maybe have as much influence?
It's either you know, you're able to experience it and it never comes back again, which has happened. Mm-hmm. Of course, it happens. Or you have to experience it many times because that's its momentum, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't matter again, because every time you're willing to be here, of course, its momentum lessens, right?
Yeah, you're not reinforcing it.
Exactly, because you're not moving with it anymore. You're not saying, you know, well, that's okay, and let's just do that, right?
Yeah. There's something we kind of skipped over when you were telling your Papaji story. And that is the word transmission. It seems that, you know, what was really going on there was far beyond whatever words Papaji was speaking or you were understanding. There was on a much more profound level, there was a transmission taking place, which was the real you know, engine behind the transformation that you underwent.
It's so hard to say anything about that, you know, because of course, right? But can I really say something about it, you know?
Well, perhaps what you could say about it is, oh, go ahead.
I would just say, just being in Papaji's presence, that means being in the presence of truth, being in the presence of somebody who really has recognized truth, which means the mind stops there. It just doesn't have a place to go, right?
Yeah.
So just being exposed to that, you know, does it do something? Of course it does, right? Because when you are in it, like you were using the example of the light bulb, when you are in the field of that, everything within you gets informed. That's the truth. That's the truth. It's a non-verbal information, but yet still it gets informed, right? This is the truth. This is the truth. This is the truth, right? Mm-hmm. So of course.
So in light of your own experience with Papaji and also your experience now of many years now as a teacher, how much priority or emphasis would you place on the importance of being in the physical proximity of an awakened person as opposed to kind of doing it on your own?
I would say it's individual, I would say when there is the true desire for freedom, it would attract you to where you need to be. Mm-hmm. And if that means being with a person physically or in their proximity or in that sphere of influence, then that's what your job is. And if it means to just be in the mountains or in the middle of the city on your own, then that's, like look at Ramana, right? Ramana had a spontaneous awakening when he was 16 and mm-hmm. and that was it, right?
Yeah.
Then he had that still draw and pull, and the recognition of Arunachala as something that is the thing. And he made himself there, and after he arrived there, that was it, right? Mm-hmm. There wasn't any need for anything, right? Neither before or after for him. But is that true for all of us? No, of course not. So right. It's individual. Yeah.
Same thing with Amachi, she, the hugging saint, she never had a teacher. She just kind of like, it was like a...
Exactly. Natural, spontaneous. It just happened, right?
Yeah. At one point, are we doing okay on time? You're.
Yeah, we're doing okay. Maybe
okay.
another few minutes. Yeah.
Okay. At one point, I heard you say something about the strong desire for freedom being instrumental in, bringing about awakening, and there's traditional sources for this too. In the Yoga Sutras, for instance, Patanjali talks about the degree of intensity of one's desire is going to have an impact on the speed of the realization. But then again, there's this popular term, and in fact even Papaji said it, of stop seeking. So there seems to be a kind of a contradiction there between strong desire and stop seeking. That's a question.
Yeah, I lost you here for a moment. So
oh, okay. How much did you?
Contradiction in yes, I hear what you're saying.
Okay, good.
So I think what Papaji also said, and what I would say for sure, is that desire for freedom is the only true desire, mm-hmm. right? Because it doesn't seek anything external. You see, it seeks its own nature, right? So it's not a desire for anything, right? So the desire for freedom, what it means, you see, it doesn't mean necessarily I'm sitting there thinking, I have to be free, I have to be free, I have to be free, right? But desire of freedom means there's a certain intensity and a certain fire and a certain devotion and a certain surrender to that need to know your own nature and to that need to find out, there's a certain power to that, there's a certain strength to that, right? Mm-hmm. So that is what's going to help you to discriminate in the beginning between this and everything else, right?
Yeah.
So, because in the beginning, like, there's so many things going on that is like, what's true, and then there's this one place that is just burning with wanting something, and what is it? Food, this, that? No, but it's wanting something, right? It's so that I find that's instrumental, because that moves us towards what we want, right? Mm-hmm. But then of course we come into the presence of somebody like Papaji, who the mind just doesn't enter, right? The mind doesn't. And I always thought Papaji is like the Cookie Monster from the Sesame Street, like the mind just gets eaten up in his presence, because he's just sitting there, and the stillness is so powerful, Mm-hmm. And so then you come into a presence like Papaji and he says, just stop, right?
I see.
Because you arrived in a place where it brought you far enough, you see. It took you out of the samsara, you know. It took you out of the, like, everything matters and let's go everywhere, let's do everything. And it focused your attention on something that is really important until you found a place that told you enough. You already here, just stop, right?
Yeah.
That's the end of that desire, of course, but it had its function, it was natural. So.
Very good. I'm glad to hear you say that, because a lot of times people read this, you know, stop seeking, and it's way premature. They're not sitting in the presence of somebody like Papaji, and, you know, they might interpret that as, oh, well, might as well just sit back on the couch and crack a beer, you know, watch.
But what he always means when he says stop seeking, he says now. In this moment, stop looking for anything.
Yeah.
Look here you are. Don't look for anything. Stop seeking.
Right.
Stop looking. Stop looking.
Stop looking somewhere else.
Somewhere else. Here it is. That's what he means. Stop seeking now, right? Now.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Okay, a couple more questions, then we'll wrap it up. I've interviewed a number of people who before they had ever heard of Ramana or anything else, actually had a visitation from him. They were walking down the street, or they were sitting in their bedroom or whatever, and this Indian man shows up, and they'd never seen him before. Maybe years later they saw his face on a book cover, and then, oh, that's the guy I saw. What do you think is going on with that?
Well, again, consciousness, you know. By the way, Papaji had visitation from Ramana too, right? Before he met him in person. Mm-hmm. And I would say, you know, consciousness, the truth responds to a true desire. So wherever there's a true desire, the truth itself will respond to that in whatever way it's necessary, you see. So if it's a vision of Ramana or a visitation, because it's not a vision, if it's a visitation of Ramana, if it's a book that we find, if it's a word that we hear, if it's a person that we get to talk to and they tell us about something, you know, that's a natural mechanism, right? It's a natural thing. It just, so many people have experienced that, you know, strong desire, they go and they find a book and they go like, wow, you know, because that's their response, right? And there is also something about the lineage, you know. There's also something about the lineage, that the lineage just, I don't know how that is, but it's predestined, right? So there will be also that choice, so to speak, again, you know, because who is choosing, right? That it ends up in this particular, you know, in this particular stream, in this particular, you know, ocean. So
yeah, to me it's fascinating, because it points to the idea that there's, you know, such a depth, such a incomprehensibly vast intelligence that's kind of governing the universe, that could actually, you know, show us the face of Ramana a decade before we actually even encounter his picture on a book or something. You know, why it's like fascinating that this kind of thing can happen.
Our imagination of what's happening is so small, right?
Yeah.
What we can think is so tiny, so there is just such a much vaster, you know, design really happening here, you know, that when we recognize that, when we realize that, that's where that sense of unshakable okayness with everything comes from. Because when we recognize that everything is taken care of, really, you know, truly, it's all been in its design forever, you know, we really don't have to do that. So
yeah, no, that's really beautiful. I mean, we're hinting around at the G word here, you know, God, but there really is that sort of well, you expressed it very beautifully just then. There's a sort of a design, or a kind of a cosmic intelligence that seems to have a hand in how things are going in our lives.
Yeah, it's already happening, you know, it's been already in motion, you know, we're just catching up. We're just like, oh yeah, wow, that's amazing, that's happening, you know. But
yeah, I read an article the other day that astronomers now believe that there are literally billions of inhabitable planets in our galaxy alone. And, you know, kind of like dwell on that for a second and think about, you know, what a vast play this is that, you know, we're playing our little part in.
Yeah, and Papaji used to say, you know, millions of universes, you know, millions of beings, you know, in a space that doesn't have any depth at all, you see. So.
Fascinating. Great. Well, this is been wonderful, or to use a phrase that I heard you say many times, and I've grown very fond of it, good, good.
There we go. You said it, Rick. You did it. You are it. You are the man.
That it became a very endearing sort of term. I like the way you say that with your Polish accent. So I really appreciate having had this opportunity. It's been a very enjoyable interview. Is there anything you'd like to say in closing, or have we pretty much taken care of it?
No, I think it's good. It's good.
Okay, good. So let me just make a couple of concluding remarks. I've been speaking with Neelam. This is an interview in an ongoing series, and if you have enjoyed this, then there you can find many more on YouTube or by going to batgap.com, and you can subscribe there to be notified by email of whenever a new one comes up, and also you can subscribe to the YouTube channel and you'll be notified that way. This is also available as a podcast, so you can listen in audio on your iPod or whatever. And there's a discussion group at batgap.com, which often becomes quite lively, with even hundreds of sometimes very intelligent comments being posted by people around each interview. So each interview has its own little discussion group that develops. So feel free to go there and participate in that if you like. I'll be linking to Neelam's website from batgap.com. So if you'd like to get in touch with her and find out about courses and programs that she offers, you can just follow that link and you'll go to, and what is it, neelam.org? Is that your website?
Yeah, it's neelam.org. Yeah.
Yeah, Neelam. So you can just go there directly, but I'll also be linking to it. Have you written any books?
No, not yet. We are just working right now. We are working right now to get a book out. So.
Okay, let me know when that's out, and I'll link to that too.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
Good.
Just sit for quietly, just for a moment, okay?
Okay, good, and then you can bring us out of it when you wish.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you, Neelam.
Yes, thanks.
It's been a joy.
Thank you.
Alrighty, bye-bye.
Bye.